Okay, welcome to part two of this two-part series of talks on artificial intelligence. This talk will be about how to create human-level artificial intelligence. And we'll do it in such a way to explain what's critically unique about the human brain that you absolutely must implement if you're going to create true human-level artificial intelligence. So there's going to be continuity from the last talk, and but this talk is pretty standalone. So I won't go over the last talk, but I might recap little bits here and there. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit of preliminaries. Okay, so just going to say to screen share. So what do I need to screen share? I need to screen share this. Oh no, damn! I don't need to screen share. I'm screen sharing all kinds of stuff. I need to screen share. Okay, screen share is paused. I need to screen share. I need to screen share my diagrams. That's what I need to screen share. So I need to go to, okay, talks 2. So screen share my diagrams. Oh dear. So I'm just going to mute everybody, and but you can unmute yourselves. You can just mute all. Okay, so everyone's muted, but you can unmute yourselves. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to screen share just the preliminaries. Okay, if you're watching me on YouTube, but then basically, however you found me, just connect with me on social media, and friend me, follow me, support me on Patreon, or just PayPal me. Basically, give me your Bitcoin, give me your time, give me whatever, but support me and help me do these talks and these videos. Okay, so that's that done. So now, oh, screen sharing is paused. Damn, screen sharing is paused. Okay, stop share. Oh, bear with me because I'm a bit new to Zoom. Okay. Okay, so if you found me on YouTube, then basically connect with me, friend me, follow me on social media, or support me on Patreon, or just PayPal me. Okay, thanks a lot. Okay, so now we get on with the talk. Okay, so. Okay, a good recap of last week's talk is just basically go over the last diagram. So basically, we talked 2 hours to come to this kind of unified way of looking at life and intelligence. So basically, we're going to recap last week's talk with a single diagram, but we're also going to kind of then build on that in this talk. Okay, so the diagram we had at the end of the last talk was this. So basically, at the end of the last talk, what we showed after kind of 2 hours public speaking was basically that there's a symmetry that exists between life and intelligence. And this involves showing that there's essential symmetry between how genes and gene regulatory mechanisms work and how neurons work based on the most latest cutting edge understanding of how neurons work. So this gave us an idea, a view of the brain that shows that it works like a giant genome. Okay, so this is the kind of conclusion of last week's talk, a perfect symmetry between life and intelligence. Now, we can take the 2 columns in the diagram, basically, and we can basically make them into one column, can't we? Because in the left-hand side, we have genes and genomes and ontogenesis, okay? But then ontogenesis gives rise to body and brain. So therefore, the left-hand side of the diagram is like you can pile them up into a single continuous diagram, because the genome creates a body and creates a brain that, according to what we explained last week, goes on to work like a giant genome. Okay. Now it goes further, because it means that basically there's a kind of unified way of looking at everything that starts from the genome. Okay, so let me explain this. Okay, let me explain something kind of obvious. Okay. Okay, and we'll kind of like go deeper into it. Now, the obvious thing is basically that from a fertilized egg, from a genome, a single genome, okay, everything in your life has emanated from that genome. Okay, that's that's fairly obvious, isn't it? So what it means is that there is a single chain of causality from a fertilized egg. Without that single point, nothing in your life would have happened. Every single thing you've ever done, every kind of random thought, every spasmodic movement, every protein manufactured in your body, every cell, absolutely everything, your entire life has emanated from that genome. So therefore, there must be a single chain of causality from the genome, that point of fertilization, to everything that's ever happened in your life. Okay. Now, it means that there is a single emanation. Okay. Now, last week's talk, we basically had this binary tree language that captured everything in this diagram. Absolutely both sides of the diagram, we captured it with this binary kind of discrete maths language that's kind of flexible. The binary trees literally flex about. It means this emanation from a fertilized egg, we have a single language to describe it, okay? Now, can we capture that single emanation with a single theory? And I think the answer is yes. Okay, the answer is yes. So this single theory is what we're going to explain now. So basically, there's a single theory, we believe, that allows us to capture everything that's ever happened from fertilized egg, and also allows us to create true artificial intelligence. Now, how can this possibly be the case? Everything that's ever happened in your life captured in a single theory. And the reason is because there is a single process. There's a way of looking at everything that's happened since that point of fertilization to conceptualize it as a single process. Let's go to the next diagram. Okay, so what is that process? What is that unifying process that we can then use to create this kind of unifying critical AI algorithm? And that process is this. Now, evolution, what is evolution? Now, in the Santa Fe Institute, which studies complexity, so the good folks at the Santa Fe Institute, they study evolution, they study all kinds of things. But in the abstract, how they describe evolution is this, that basically they describe evolution as a process of differentiate, select, amplify. Now, what does it mean? It means basically, okay, so basically from kind of conventional terms, evolution is differentiating into different kind of varieties of offspring. So you've got variation, differentiation into different species and variation within a species. You have select, obviously that's natural selection. And you have amplify, which means those selected specimens, they breed, they kind of consolidate their numbers in the population pool. So evolution, you see, is basically this process of differentiate, select, amplify in its most abstract sense. Now, also, if we just expand that kind of like window there, so you can see me slightly bigger on YouTube. Okay, now ontogenesis, which we think is really important. Ontogenesis, the process by which a fertilized egg becomes a body, okay, morphology. Ontogenesis, the process, is also a process of differentiate, select, amplify. If you think about it, you got the kind of cell division, mitosis, but then you have this progenitor field formation, the kind of progenitor branching into kind of branches of all the kind of different parts of your body. And it's a binary process, as we discussed in the last talk. The idea that Brian Goodwin's idea, the great biologist, that ontogenesis is a bifurcation diagram, essentially a binary bifurcating process. But that's also differentiate, select, amplify, that it differentiates into different progenitor fields. Some progenitor fields are selected to survive, they're amplified, they get skin and bone, they get blood vessels, and they're amplified, and they consolidate. And some progenitor fields are programmed to die. So you see, ontogenesis is also a process of differentiate, select, amplify. Now, when we was I coughed just then, wasn't I?
There was just like the audio stopped for maybe the last 20 seconds.
Okay. Basically, I'm back. Okay, this is the Switzerland broadband is supposed to be the best in the world, but we've had problems with it. Okay, it's supposed to be like super fast. It is like it's like literally fiber optic cable right to your router box. No, literally fiber optic cable. And then we've had like more problems than I've had in the UK. So anyway, oh God. Anyway, okay, so okay, I'm just going to continue the screen share. So where was I? So basically, I'm just going to continue where I was. Okay, so where I was ontogenesis. Therefore, ontogenesis is differentiate, select, amplify, but also axons and dendrites. Now, last week's talk, we described how real axons and real dendrites, they are in flux, they are in motion. So, in real brains, it is not a static thing. It's basically like a moving thing. Now, in real brains, there's not this much motion because it's really tightly packed. There's lots of stuff in your brain. It happens at a glacial pace. But in aggregate, basically neurons are always on the move. They're always kind of reconfiguring. Now, the significance of this is basically, what is that? What is this neuron moving? Well, basically what it is, it's neurons literally physically differentiating into space. Can you see that? It's literally exploring into space, and certain kind of axons are selected, and it's very strict criteria. It's called spike time dependent plasticity. And these kind of axons form synapses, which, given the right criteria, are amplified. It means there's a way of looking at the functioning of real neurons, which is also differentiate, select, amplify. Okay, so we'll move on. Now, behavior and thought. Okay, some things we do are kind of like habitual, or we basically taught to do them. But there's this thing called reinforcement learning, where basically you explore life and you explore certain paths, and certain paths are punished, but certain paths are rewarded. So we have this basic idea that as we go through life, there is also this process of differentiate into all these different kinds of behavior we can do, of selecting the ones through reinforcement learning, selecting the ones that give us reward, and then amplifying, literally amplifying those behaviors. Okay, so a lot of what we do is habit, but as we go through life, there is this process of differentiating into a space of possibilities, selecting certain ones that give us joy, and then amplifying those behaviors. We're going to go into this into much more detail, because in order to create artificial intelligence, we need to go to the heart of the problem of what is behavior in terms of physiology. We need to basically reduce behavior and thought into the fundamental neuroscience underlying it. So we'll go into this much more detail in the next section. But to close this kind of way of looking at all these processes, emanation from a fertilized egg as a single emanation, okay, once you have behaviors and thoughts, the evolution of those behaviors and thoughts. Now, as we showed in the first talk, that there's a symmetry between evolution and learning and creativity. It means that as we innovate the thoughts and behaviors we have, that is also a process of differentiate, select, amplify. You see, so as we go down this table, this covers everything from the emanation from a fertilized egg to everything in our lives. So a single emanation from a fertilized egg, a process of differentiate, select, amplify. Okay, we're going to code that in a formal language later on in order to show how we can turn it into artificial intelligence software. Okay, the next section of the talk, we're going to go in depth into point 4. Okay, so thought and behavior. We need to really understand what's thought and behavior. Okay, so we need to go into some physiology now. So we need to go into the kind of what I think is the most essential kind of neuroscience for really creating artificial intelligence. Okay, so what we have here is a diagram of the brain. Okay, so what it is, most of your brain is cerebral cortex. Okay, so that is a kind of MRI scan. And these two sheets are basically your cerebral cortex flattened out. So it's like on either side of your head is a great big cerebral cortex sheet. If you flatten it out, that's what it looks like. Okay, so that's called cerebral, that's about 90% of your brain, 85, 90%, including the kind of white fiber or the kind of nerve tracts connecting up the cerebral cortex. Now, that's another picture of the cerebral cortex folded up. Historically, it's been divided up into about 50 what's called Broben areas. Now, more recently, it's kind of demarcated into maybe even 500 different subzones. Okay, so these are like kind of like a patchwork quilt. Each part of that patchwork quilt does a specialized function. So area 17 is primary visual cortex, secondary visual cortex. That is to do with space, that's to do with cognition, so on and so forth. So it's basically like a patchwork quilt that kind of maps all the things you think about, all the things you do. Okay, so that's a cerebral cortex, and that's the same thing flattened out with those same Broben areas, those numbers kind of superimposed on the flattened sheet that we saw at the beginning of this section. Now, there's two other really important parts of the brain which basically allow you to think and allow you to do what you do, and they are, sorry, this diagram here is just to show a kind of cross-section of the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is made up of these kind of cortical columns about 0.3 millimeters in diameter. And these are a selection of some of the neurons. So each column has about 100 neurons contained in it. The important point here is basically there is a stereotypical architecture that is made up of these cortical columns that is preserved, that's evolutionarily preserved. So basically a cortical column is found in a mouse brain, and even an experienced neuroscientist can't tell the difference between a kind of human cortical column and a mouse cortical column. So basically what we have is this idea of symmetry, as we discussed a lot in the last talk. And this is symmetry preserved over evolutionary time. And then that same symmetry block is stamped out again and again to create this massive cerebral cortex. Okay, so the same building block, just multiplied to create a cerebral cortex. The other two parts of the brain, which are really essential to allow you to think and behave, it's called, okay, this part of the brain is called the striatum. Okay, it's really old. Okay, so this goes back to, okay, all tetrapods, which means newts and salamanders and frogs, they all have a striatum. There's a stereotypical striatal circuit. Okay, this striatal circuit is evolutionary preserved. It's actually found in the kind of newts and salamanders, but it's even thought that even a lamprey is a very ancient animal. Okay, even a lamprey has a very rudimentary striatum. So the idea, like the cerebral cortex, is a stereotypical architecture that's found in a rudimentary form in the lamprey and also in frogs and newts, but it's actually replicated. That same basic architecture is replicated in your brain to create this kind of massive, you know, is bigger than a salamander, it's bigger than a frog or a newt. It's basically a striatum structure that's actually made up of this basic building block. Now, the third structure is called the cerebellum. Okay, that's a cerebellum. And again, you can flatten out into a sheet. So it's on the back of your head. It's back here. That's where the cerebellum is. And same again, there's a basic building block, a cerebellar microarchitecture, micro-complex building block that is fully represented even in a shark brain. And same again, this building block is also represented in rudimentary form, even in a lamprey brain. So again, this building block is preserved evolutionary. The symmetry is preserved over evolutionary time. Then that building block is multiplied, stamped out again and again and again and again to create this kind of quite large, flattened sheet of this duplicated structure to create your cerebellum. Okay, so now we need to explain in a minute what it does. So what is the relationship between the cerebellum and the striatum, okay, and the cerebral cortex? Is this. Okay, no, in an earlier diagram, you saw these different kind of patches of a patchwork quilt. Okay, so basically, now the frontal lobes, okay, the frontal lobes is this part here. That's all the frontal lobes in the front part of your brain. Okay, your entire frontal lobes are basically, each kind of patch of the patchwork quilt forms what's called a closed loop with the striatum. Okay, it also forms a closed loop with the cerebellum. Now it's called a closed loop because, okay, signals go from the cerebral cortex, the frontal cortex, the frontal part, and the signal goes into the striatum and it loops back, okay, via some intermediary structures, the thalamus, and then it goes back to roughly the same area. So it's a closed loop. And it's called closed because it doesn't leave the brain. The loop doesn't leave your body. It just basically forms a loop with the cerebral cortex. So, okay, there are other kind of complications. The striatum also forms closed loops with the temporal cortex and the parietal cortex to do with spatial reasoning and to do with language and memory. Okay, so there's other details, but mainly it's the kind of prefrontal cortex that's completely kind of served with these cerebellum and striatum closed loops. Okay, so here's a diagram of some of those loops, and the numbers on the top here correspond to some of those patches of patchwork quilt that we saw earlier. So these are the kind of closed loops of the striatum, and you can do the same for the cerebellum. Now here, in this diagram here, we basically have a patch of cortex. So this is one of the patches of the patchwork quilt. Okay, and what we've done is basically we've drawn in one of the cerebellum closed loops. We've drawn in one of the striatum closed loops. Now the striatum is special because it's served by this chemical called dopamine. Okay, it's a famous chemical because it's like the chemical of addiction. It's also the chemical of a kind of reinforcement behavior. So basically addiction reinforcement behavior, but it's also a chemical that allows your body to move. So you lose your dopamine, you can't think, you can't move basically. So in order to think, in order for the cerebral cortex to work, these closed loops of the striatum, in a sense, need to be greased by dopamine as a kind of a metaphor for understanding what it does. If you lose your dopamine, then it's like the wheels don't turn anymore and you can't move, you can't think. Okay, so cerebellum closed loop, striatum closed loop. Now, the question is, what do these closed loops do? Okay, so in order to understand that, we need to go into a bit more detail in the cerebral cortex. What we have is basically a hierarchical organization in the brain. So anyone here doing neural networks, doing artificial neural networks, we're completely familiar with this idea of hierarchical neural networks. Well, the brain is exactly that. So in the back part of your brain, you have primary sensory areas, like we showed earlier. The primary visual cortex will then project to the secondary visual cortex, and then project to the tertiary visual cortex. And the same with the motor areas. So at the bottom of the hierarchy, you're going to have like a primary motor areas or premotor areas. And these kind of like, send signals to your muscles. Okay, literally move your muscles about, kind of muscle complexes. And then higher up the hierarchy, you're going to have what's called a supplementary motor area and what's called a pre-supplementary motor area. Okay, now the important thing, the point we have to emphasize here is basically the top-down projection pattern. As you go from the top of the hierarchy down the hierarchy, there's a very specific projection pattern. Okay, what that pattern is basically the outputs will leave. Okay, where my mouse is. Okay, so actually, if I'm gonna just do annotate. Okay, annotate. I find this little funny arrow here. Okay, you see here. Okay, basically where the top-down projection is coming out here. It's coming out from layer 5. And the stereotypical pattern of projection is basically the top-down pattern of projection. It ends up in layer 1. And then in the next layer, layer 5 to layer 1, can you see? Now the bottom-up pattern of projection is quite different. It goes from layers 2 and 3 into layer 4. So 2 and 3, this is bottom-up, goes to layer 4. Same again, 2 and 3 to layer 4. Now, most neural networks, okay, backpropagation deep learning networks, what they do, I mean, one of the big names, Yann LeCun, has confirmed that's his view, that basically what deep neural networks is basically doing the bottom-up pathway. That's all it's doing. What's of interest is basically the top-down pathway is actually, outnumbers the bottom-up pathway in terms of fibers, in terms of amount of information sent by 5, even 10 times. So usually, often 80% of the fibers is actually top down, and a mere 10 to 20% is actually bottom up. So neural networks are even here are missing something quite fundamental, I believe. We're going to show you what that is. The meaning of top down, bottom up is this. Okay, top down means you go from abstraction to spatial complexity. And bottom up means you go from spatial complexity to abstraction. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you look at something, okay, there's lots of data coming into your eyes. It's lots of bandwidth, lots of data. And you might see a cat, okay, that cat become abstracted into something abstract, the symbol cat. Whereas top down is something different. You go from abstract to something spatially complex. You might want to draw a cat, or you might want to talk about behavior, kind of like move your arms and legs about. But the actual moving your arms and legs about, that's really complex, involves lots of complex signals controlling your muscles. So that's the meaning of top down, bottom up. Okay, now in order to really understand the stratum and the cerebellum, we need to talk about some recent research. Well, it's not actually, it's 10 years ago now. I mean, time does fly, doesn't it? And that research came from Japan. What they found was basically the closed loops of the cerebellum end up in layer 4, and the closed loops of the stratum end up predominantly in layer 1. What it means is basically, okay, so what it means, the bottom-up pathway, basically the bottom-up pathway that ends up in layer 4 is where the cerebellum projects to, but a top-down pathway ending in layer 1 is where the stratum projects to. So what does it mean? It means that basically now we can understand what the cerebellum and the stratum does. And what it does is this, it's to do with automatizing behaviors, okay? What does it mean? Most of our behaviors are automatized, they're reinforced, and basically we can do them automatically. Okay, let me explain this with an example. When I was a bit younger, in my 20s, about 20, 30 years ago now, I used to love learning kind of Jimi Hendrix songs and Van Halen songs, okay? So you play these really fast, like riffs on the guitar, and you learn it from these kind of tablature books. You have these kind of like, tells you where to put the fingers, put the finger here, then you slide it down, you do this, and you do that, do that. Now basically, you just basically, position your fingers and you go through the motions. And then you do it a couple of times and then you automatize it. Okay, so basically, then you don't need the music notation anymore. You just do it. Okay. Now, how do you do it? Well, you use your cerebellum and your striatum. That's how you do it. What it means is basically, what it's doing is basically, once you get away the music notation and you don't want to think about what you're doing, how do you automatize? You automatize because there's information in your fingers that can drive the next state. And with the striatum top down, there's information of what you've done before, top down, that can drive the next state. So basically, it means that the striatum and the cerebellum are automatizing. They're basically taking information from what's gone on before, you know, what's kind of preceded, and they're using that to drive the next state, you see. So you don't have to look at the music notation anymore. You don't even have to think about what you're doing. Just the kind of music just rolls out your fingers. So it's automatized. Okay, like changing a gear stick on a car, it becomes automatic. This facility is really important for obviously robotic control, but also obviously for intelligence. We don't want to think about the things we're doing, the things we're thinking, the things we have to do. They're all made automatic. This is a really powerful facility. Okay, so more on the striatum and the cerebellum. Okay, the diagram I had earlier is here now. And okay, it's clear all the drawings. Now, what I drew earlier is a single kind of closed loop striatal cerebellar complex with the cerebral cortex. Okay, so there is what I drew earlier. Now, because the brain is hierarchical, I can then stick on the next level of the hierarchy. Can you see? So all the kind of projections are drawn in the right layers. And then further on, I can draw in the pre-supplementary motor areas. So you see that that's the motor kind of hierarchy that is allowing me to move my kind of fingers on the guitar fretboard. That's where the automatization is going on. Can you see? So that's one hierarchy involving the cerebellum and the striatum to do with motor control. And 30 years ago, when I started studying the brain, it was thought that the cerebellum and the striatum was just involved with this area, you know, kind of the primary motor cortex and the supplementary motor areas. Now, in the past 30 years, it's been discovered that the cerebellum and the striatum covers the entire prefrontal lobes and also the emotion centers. Now, if I go on, okay, I take this entire diagram and I shift it to, can I see, I shifted the entire diagram to the right here. And now I add another hierarchy. This is the cognitive hierarchy. And I join the two hierarchies up. It means that there is one kind of loop of kind of automatization from what you think to the movement of your fingers to the motions of your arms and legs. Okay, it's like a one kind of hierarchical structure of automatization involving the cerebellum and the striatum. What was kind of recently rediscovered, which was known actually before, is that also the emotion centers, which means hypothalamus, amygdala, what's called subgenual nucleus of the cingulate cortex, these emotion centers are also automatized with exactly the same cerebellum striatum circuits. Now, this was quite shocking to a lot of people because basically, you know, we think emotion centers somehow different from the centers of cognition. But no. There's the same basic stereotypical architecture involving the cerebellum and the striatum and the dopamine circuits to do with the really apex of your brain, what actually makes you do what you do. Now, this is fascinating, isn't it? It means from the hypothalamus, which detects the most basic drives of thirst, sex, warmth and heat and thirst, etc., and food desire. Basically, from that apex of motivation, there's a single automatization hierarchy involving the cerebellum and the striatum and dopamine. Okay, so this is basically the kind of overall architecture of the brain. We can add on the rest. Okay, so what's missing is the sensory areas in the back of your head, which then project to the prefrontal cortex, and we add it here, look. So basically, it gets really messy now. Okay, so here we've added the kind of sensory part of your brain, and we basically interfaced it with the kind of like the parts that the automatized parts that we've been talking about. So that is essentially a basic diagram of brain architecture that emphasizes the symmetry between all the different areas. And there's a single kind of hierarchy of automatization. Now, there is caveats. Okay, so basically there is this underlying symmetry, which this diagram shows, but then there is a kludge factor. So in real brain, there's all kinds of, it's not so clean. So there's many converging paths from different areas of sensory areas into different parts of the cerebellum and also different parts of the striatum. So the actual diagram it would be far more messy if we drew in all these paths. And it's not a strict hierarchy. I mean, one layer of the hierarchy doesn't strictly project to just the adjacent layer in the hierarchy. So sometimes they might skip a layer, and then, but predominantly 80%, 90% of all projections are to the next level. And there are some kind of like kludge factors. I mean, we talked about kludges in the last talk. Now, the brain is not a kludge, but there is a kludge factor. So there's an underlying symmetrical design. But on top of that, you do have this kind of like messy kind of fibers all over the place factor. Another thing I can explain is that there's like a kludge factor, which is that from the amygdala, there's actually a direct connection. See where I'm wiggling the cursor, the amygdala, and there's actually a direct connection to the primary sensory cortex, the primary visual cortex. So again, these kind of like fiber pathways, which kind of are superimposed on this kind of neat kind of symmetrical design. Okay, but underneath it is this kind of very clean architecture that can actually program into a computer and actually use to create true artificial intelligence. Okay, what do these kind of loops do? Okay, these kind of temporal loops, what do they do? Okay, they're automatizing things in time, but how do they do it? And why does a loop represent time? It's because this diagram shows why. Okay, so suppose this is kind of one part of the cerebral cortex or stratum. If you loop back to the cortex, if you loop back to it, okay, what it means is basically at any time t, you have a signal, okay, but if you loop back, then by the time you loop back, a new signal has arrived, which is t+1. So therefore, it means that basically this kind of virtual cerebral cortex forms a conjugation of t, the previous signal, with t+1. And if you loop that signal back again, then basically you conjugate what you just made, which is t and t+1 with t+2 now. So you see, by looping back, you're basically conjugating in time successive frames of inputs. So you basically representing time. Now, how does it do it? We need to really go down into the kind of fundamentals of reinforcement learning. Now, how does it do it? Okay, this diagram we showed in the last talk of a kind of like unbalanced binary tree representing time. But can you see that unbalanced binary tree is exactly the same as this tree inverted? So if I flip that on the kind of horizontal axis, that kind of like binary tree structure is exactly the same as this binary tree here. Okay. So it means in abstract, I can use these unbalanced binary trees to represent time, and these kind of frames, which can represent patches of cerebral cortex, or this kind of grid can represent the entire cerebral cortex. So it's fractal. So basically, you can use one tiny square to be a kind of like one of those kind of patches on a patchwork quilt, and you can use the entire grid to represent the entire cerebral cortex. Okay, so exactly how does the reinforcement process work? Okay, so the criteria is this. So we need to explain. Okay, I don't need to just go to that diagram yet. I need to explain what that process is. Okay, it involves dopamine. So what is this? Okay, so I'm going to go off the diagrams for a bit and so stop screen share for a little bit and just go to. This is how I do it. This is how it's done. Okay, so what a dopamine does is this. Now dopamine kind of with the stratum, okay, works in such a way that basically there's two modes. There's what's called kind of phasic dopamine, which means there's a certain level of dopamine you need to function. So if you lose that, you get Parkinson's disease, akinetic mutism. You can't move, you can't do anything. So there's a basic dopamine tone, and you can increase that dopamine tone with certain drugs like cocaine or even caffeine or amphetamine, and then you move faster. You're more fluid. Basically, the wheels turn a bit smoother. Now, okay, the other mode is basically it's phasic. So basically, you have this dopamine tone, but then suddenly the level of dopamine can increase, and then go back to its baseline again. So it's kind of burst firing. And there's another mode where basically the level of dopamine, the dopamine tone can dip suddenly. Okay, now what's the criteria for a kind of rising and dipping? It's this. Unexpected reward. Okay, something unexpected happens that make you go, wow, that's amazing. I feel good about that. So I walk down the street. This is a very contrived example. I'm walking down the street and I see a £10 note. I go, wow, there's a £10 note there. I feel rewarded. Okay. And what happens is my dopamine levels rise, unexpected reward. Okay, so what it means is that, okay, suppose I'm like a tramp, I just wander around the streets of London, I could do a random walk around the streets of London. It means that behavior becomes reinforced. I tend to go down that same street again. And for some reason, I keep finding £10 notes there and I feel rewarded all the time. But then the reward becomes expected and the dopamine no longer rises. I just do it out of habit. Okay. Now, how does dopamine level fall? It falls when basically I'm walking down that street and I am expecting a £10 note and there's no £10 note and the dopamine levels fall. Now, what does it do to our loop? What does it do to our loop that goes from the cerebral cortex into the stratum and back again? This is what it does. Okay, the loop is like a chain. You're chaining behaviors in time and you're doing it with dopamine. So what it does is this: when the dopamine rises, then the connection from the cerebral cortex into the stratum that's modulated by dopamine, when dopamine rises, the synapse is strengthened. So that literally physically reinforced, that loop representing that behavior of walking down that street to get the £10 notes, literally the chain is reinforced. When I'm disappointed, okay, dopamine level falls. What it does physiologically, that same connection from the cerebral cortex into the stratum weakens the link. It's long-term depression. So literally the behavior is uncoupled. You see, it breaks down, you don't do it anymore. We believe that this mechanism implemented in artificial intelligence is really the mechanism for really doing real reinforcement learning. And the diagram I showed you earlier on is really the mechanism for controlling robots and doing kind of real world AI. A short word on cerebellum. Now, if you lose your stratum, then basically you can't move, you can't do anything, you can't think. The situation with the cerebellum is slightly different. There are some people born with no cerebellum, and they can still live, they can still function, but their movements are very wobbly. Okay, they can't move properly, they can't think, the thoughts are not as sharp. So you can get by with losing your cerebellum, but if you lose your stratum, you're absolutely, basically you're dead. Basically, you can't do anything. Okay, so that's a slight important point just to make. Now, there's something complementary to this forward diverging process. So we kind of what we talked about earlier, this differentiate, select, amplify process. What we've done now is basically just go into detail with respect to the behavior and thoughts. So we go into detail how physiologically the dopamine literally selects and amplifies certain behaviors. Okay, but there's a complementary thing we need to explain, because we need to explain how or why we valued the £10 note in the first place. How did we attach value to the £10 note? This is really important, because we need to give artificial intelligence a sense of meaning and purpose. But then where does it come from? Well, when we're born, we have no sense of the world. We're born with very simple kind of hardwired desires and fears. Where are these kind of what called unconditioned reinforcers and factors? Where are they located? They're located in the hypothalamus and the amygdala. So these are hardwired. You're born with these basic fears and desires for food, for warmth, etc., homeostasis. Okay, so one kind of way of explaining and modeling how you form your web of meaning and purpose is this. It's called a diffusion limited aggregate. Okay, so the diffusion limited aggregate is used to model natural growth processes. It's actually very widely used in physics and in modeling natural phenomena. And we think that this kind of web of meaning and purpose in your brain grows in exactly the same way through a diffusion limited aggregate. Okay, let me explain with an animation. So what it means is basically a diffusion limited aggregate. You have a sticky point, or in this case, 4 sticky points with 4 different colors. And you have these kind of random Brownian motion of these particles, and they zip around and they move around. And then they will stick onto these initial points. And once they stick on, they become that color, and they themselves become sticky. Okay, so now if I use an animation just to illustrate this process. Okay, so those four initial points we have here are in this animation. So if I start it, basically, it starts, okay, so when it starts, you have the 4 points. It grows very quickly initially. So it's okay, so it starts. You see, the particles are zipping around and they're sticking on to one of the 4 points. And that makes it sticky also. And then it grows outwards. in the same way, those initial 4 points are like your kind of basic drives in the hypothalamus. Now, baby has no idea of £10 notes, does it? It has no idea of money. A baby knows basically simple things like a sensation of, kind of a nipple in its mouth satisfying its hunger. There may be baby food satisfies its hunger. Then maybe later on it learns that the baby food comes from a jar and it comes from a cupboard. And then later on it learns that that it comes from a supermarket as mummy rolls the baby through supermarkets. It learns all these kind of backward chains, this chain of association from the kind of sensation of a kind of nipple in its mouth, a kind of sensation of baby food in its mouth, to going to the supermarket. And then the baby sees that mummy gives the cashier money. And then backward chain, then you eventually learn the value of money. The idea is basically these 4 dots could represent sex, they could represent kind of warmth, kind of satisfying your hunger, satisfying basic things like thirst. But the main point is basically you are inbuilt with these basic seed points. And in your life as a baby, you basically grow out this web of meaning and purpose. It's basically a web of salience and affordance. And as you grow it backwards, that is the web of meaning and purpose in your head. Okay, so, I'm back to a tramp doing my random walk around London streets. Okay, so I just basically wander around those streets randomly. So there's a complementary forward tree that goes forward in time, kind of doing various things, doing this and that. And this forward DSA, differentiate, select, amplify, reinforcement tree that basically explores life, goes into life and explores different possibilities. That forward tree intersects with this backward tree. Can you see how it grows? And one of those points in this backward tree is money and the value of £10 notes. So it means that there's a way of looking at behavior overall. There's a way of looking at behavior which shows that your entire web of meaning in your head, the web in your mind, the entire web of all the representations in your head are basically 2 trees. There's a tree of divergence and a tree of convergence. And with this diagram, I represent it. So basically, the backward aggregating tree is the tree of all desire, all kind of all meaning, salience, and affordance, all the things that have meaning and purpose in your life. And the forward emanating tree is the kind of reinforcement tree, the stratum cerebellum circuit of all the behaviors reinforced to get those basic desires or escape pain. Okay, so that's a kind of like a way of looking at the overall kind of like what's happening with your kind of with your life, this forward emanation that intersects with this backward emanation. Now we go right back to the beginning of part 2 of this talk. We said that everything begins from this fertilized egg, and there's this unifying, differentiate, select, amplify process that emanates outwards from this fertilized egg, and then basically intersects with this other backward tree. Now, it's a fair thing to say that basically of all the kind of like drives, if these 4 points represent basic drives, there's a prime directive. Okay, we do a lot of things in life. There's a prime directive, which we obsess over as teenagers or in our early 20s. And it's basically reproduction. So it means that there's a very elegant way of looking at your entire life as a simple emanation from a fertilized egg in order to get to the point to fertilize eggs. And it's full circle. And then that tree of your emanation aggregation into a point becomes a node on a family tree. I know it's a funny thing to say that your entire life you're going to be a node on a family tree, but it's true. So your entire purpose becomes to emanate all these behaviors to satisfy that prime directive to emanate from a fertilized egg to fertilize eggs. So that's a very neat way of looking at things, isn't it? We're going to revisit neurons now. So that's the kind of like behavior, what's happening in our minds. We're very on a kind of grand scale. Okay, we're talking a grand web of knowledge in our heads. We're going to revisit last talk and about neurons. Okay, we kind of went over again that neurons have this kind of like dynamic aspect. They're kind of like differentiating, selecting into space. Now, what's really important for the kind of new generation of neural networks based on how real neurons work is this new learning rule, basically, that is kind of like not represented in existing neural networks. And this has really come out in the past 10, 15 years. Okay, the idea that there is a synapse, there is an axon, and that axon will connect with a kind of, let's stop the screen share for a bit so you can see me wave my hands about again. Okay, so the new learning rule is this, and it's exactly what neural network people are saying it needs to be the case. It's called compositional learning. Okay, So neural networks now basically are kind of like they kind of recycle all the weights in these kind of deep convolutional neural nets. But how real brains work, as we discussed in the last talk, is very different. What we have there is this kind of compartmentalized structure where the kind of dendrite is compartmentalized in these kind of like 30 to 50 micrometer compartments along a stretch of dendrite. And what it's doing is it's doing compositional learning, which means that it's taking, not just inputs from the pre-synapse to the post-synapse to strengthen a synapse. It's actually doing learning between adjacent synapses. Okay, so synapses will come from, axons will come from different neurons representing different things. And this new mode of learning is literally taking adjacent synapses on a patch of dendrite, and it's compositing them, it's compositionally bringing them together to make a composite representation. Now, like a diffusion limited aggregate, it starts from one central synapse that then kind of feeds the surrounding synapses. So then you form this kind of representational kind of block, kind of like this dendritic compartment. But what's also been discovered is that then the compartments themselves chain together into bigger composite structures. And it's been found that there is a kind of retrograde from the cell body, reinforcing from the cell body, the cell spikes, and then basically reinforces compartments close to the cell body. And it's been found that there's a backward chaining of these representational compartments to make ever more complex representational compositional chunks. You see, like diffusion limited aggregate is actually working its way back along the dendrites. What it means is a way of looking at dendrites that shows that they work essentially like the kind of diffusion limited aggregate of our entire mind. So from the macrocosm of the dendrite, how it works, differentiate, to select, amplify its axons, to how it forms these clusters, like diffusion limited aggregates, aggregating from the cell body and the cell spiking, just like the kind of like backward chaining, a baby learning about baby food and money. So the microcosm of a neuron reflects the macrocosm of, overall behavior. Okay, that's quite, self-similar and fractal, isn't it? Now, it takes a bit of time, but you can also apply the same principle to not all the intermediate levels, but many intermediate levels in between. So I've explained it for a neuron, and we can also interpolate it to the functioning of genes. But kind of intermediate levels of the brain, kind of columns, macro columns, the kind of cerebellum, stratum, cortical complexes we talked about earlier, that same process, that same basic symmetry that we can describe for the entire functioning, the entire web of all your knowledge, all your desires, all your fears, and all your behaviors to a neuron, we can also describe it to many intermediate layers in between. So fractal, self-similar. Okay, so that's a very interesting idea. Okay, now, we've gone to a stage now. Okay, the next part of the talk, we're going to show that what we've explained so far, the kind of neuroscience we've explained, implicit in that kind of explanation and kind of unified way of looking at things is really the unification of the best ideas in existing AI. Okay, we've done all the work, we've done all the hard work. Now we're going to go through this kind of master algorithm thing. We're going to go through the most fundamental idea in artificial intelligence. And we're going to show that these kind of pressing problems in artificial intelligence and machine learning, the solutions to them just pop out of the things we've explained. We're going to show how all these existing ideas kind of become incorporated, are subsumed by this unified brain theory. So we're going to now, unify kind of the best ideas in artificial intelligence. Back to screen share. Okay, so here we are. You just cut the neurons and just go to the next stage. And okay, look, this diagram here is basically kind of like two books. Okay, now artificial intelligence, a modern approach by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig. Peter Norvig was the kind of head honcho at Google for a long time. I think he retired now, but he was the overall head of kind of the overall, the overall advisor for all things technical to Google. It's because he was a Stanford professor, and Google came out of Stanford. That's why he had this kind of like position to kind of like advise overall on the technology of Google. Now he co-wrote a book called Artificial Intelligence: A Modern Approach. It is the Bible of artificial intelligence learning in universities, undergraduate, postgraduate, postdoc, etc. I read 10 years ago that 95% of all courses use this textbook. That number might be changed slightly, but it's still very prominent. And the other book here is called Master Algorithm. It made the rounds about 5-6 years ago, written by a professor of machine learning, Pedro Domingos. Okay, so he talks about master algorithm that unifies kind of his view, which is a worldview, which is machine learning algorithms, and how to actually, the quest to find this master algorithm. He doesn't describe how to do it. He just suggests the program that it needs to be done, and it'd be amazing if we had it. We're going to show that basically the unification of what I call the most fundamental idea in this book, and also the ideas in this book, master algorithm, pop out from the things we've explained so far in part 1 and this early section of this talk. Okay, so there is a fundamental idea in the book, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach. Okay, it's so fundamental. It's the first, well, not chapters 1 and 2, they kind of like set the philosophy of their approach. It kind of chapters, the 10 of the first 12 chapters, many of those chapters go over this idea again and again and again. Okay, what is the idea? I'll tell you what it is. I call it the most fundamental idea in AI, and it's not actually covered in Master Algorithm, the book. This most fundamental idea is this. Okay, the first chapters are to do with search, okay, searching a space of possibilities. And there's a diagram from that book, and basically it's about tree search. You're searching into a space of possibilities, okay, search algorithms. And there's two complementary processes. There's a kind of, like you can see, there's a kind of like a branching outwards process starting from a goal. And there's a search process going backwards from the goal. So there's a backward tree going from the goal, and there's a forward tree going from the start, and the two trees intersect, and there's your answer. Now, this idea occurs again and again in the first kind of like section of the book, first third of the book. So it's the most fundamental idea in AI. So this kind of diverging into a space of possibilities and a kind of backward chaining from this goal state, it occurs again and again. For instance, I mean, they talk about it in terms of abstract search into, search space, abstract game search or whatever. But also, for instance, when they talk about chess, the start is basically the current position of the board, or the start of the game of chess, and the goal is the end game where you checkmate. And they describe a kind of forward chaining process and a backward chaining from that goal of winning, checkmating your enemy. And where you have a path that links the two, that's the answer. And another example is a chapter on logic. To prove a logic theorem, there's a goal to prove the theorem, and then your initial axioms. If your axioms, that's your start phase, there's a forward search of all the kind of derivations from those axioms. And then they do a backward search from the thing you're trying to prove. And when the two trees intersect, that's your answer. Another example is situation calculus to control a robot. Okay, here's the robot here. The robot needs to be there. They use propositional logic, predicate logic, and to specify the robot state. Okay, so you forward chain from where the robot is to all the things it can do. Where the robot needs to be, you backward chain. Okay, and where the two paths meet, that's your path. There goes the robot. But can you see, it's the same idea. But what is the idea? The idea is exactly differentiate, select, amplify into a state of possibilities, and it's backward chaining like a diffusion limited aggregate from the goal state, which is exactly our symmetry that we think is the overarching symmetry for understanding the brain, and is also reflected in the functioning of a neuron. Okay, so this next section describes the Master Algorithm book. Now, Pedro Domingos is a very competent kind of machine learning professor. Okay, he, Washington University, works closely with Microsoft in the same state. Now, in his book, he described 5 tribes of machine learning. And what I've done here, I've got 6 tribes because he's missed out a very important tribe called reinforcement learning. Okay, DeepMind in London, they say reinforcement learning is at the heart of their activities. And also OpenAI, which is very prominent in America, they have said when they began that reinforcement learning is really, really important. So we've added it as point 2. Now, okay, the 6 tribes of machine learning, okay, it's actually very easy to unify these 6 tribes because we've done all the work. Okay, as we said in the first part of this 2-part talk, evolution is central to this generative, creative, differentiate, select, amplify algorithm that we think is key to creating all the other algorithms. So essentially, we have subsumed the evolutionists in the most exquisite way by having a more complete view of evolution. It's not just kind of, point mutation and crossing over, and kind of like what's happening in machine learning is a far broader view of evolutionary generative algorithms we have. And also reinforcement learning. Basically, there's many ways of doing reinforcement learning in the machine learning, artificial intelligence world. But we suggest the best way is the way we know what works best, how real brains do reinforcement learning. So what we suggest is to just replace all the existing methods and reverse engineer the brain to subsume and do a far better version of reinforcement learning. In terms of, okay, connectionists, in the first talk, there was a diagram saying that Geoffrey Hinton, who is the kind of godfather of connectionism, he is the absolute kind of like, the biggest name in what's called deep convolutional neural networks using backpropagation. Now, he said that his intuition was just to throw it all away and start again. That the way, backpropagation works, it gets the best results, but it's not actually the right way of doing things. Now, if he's saying to get rid of it all and start again, what do we start again with? How about a new version of neural networks that works based on how real neurons work? That also works in such a way that this kind of the neurons working in a kind of differentiate, select, amplify, kind of backward chaining, diffusion, limited aggregate way. That's actually a symmetry to how evolution works and also how reinforcement learning works. So it's actually a far kind of like a kind of sysatisfactory way of doing connectionism. So there's a new generation of neural networks based on real neurons. Now, the fourth tribe, symbolists, which means language processing, it also means processing logical propositions. So that's symbolic processing. Now, okay, language in the brain is actually subserved by those same dopamine, stratum, cerebellum, cortical circuits that we described earlier. So in a sense, using that canonical circuit, we subsume kind of like language processing. Now, we described this binary tree language in the last talk. And what are symbols? What is language? What is logic? It's essentially binary tree structures. But the real kind of like the way that the symbolic processing aspect is really kind of subsumed by this new approach is this idea that how neurons actually work. There's a mode of how neurons work. In the last talk, we described how neurons do things like XOR processing on tiny slivers of dendrite and also on dendritic branches. It does complex logical operations like conjunction, disjunction, exclusive OR. What does it mean? It means that basically neurons work in a way that's symbolic. In the same way, language is compositional. You composite letters together to make words. You compositionally make kind of sentences with words. Okay, essentially, what we've described is basically how real neurons work is essentially compositional. Now, this is one of the biggest kind of like issues right now in these kind of like AI conferences. How do you reconcile the symbolic with the sub-symbolic? And the answer is simply that you have a new generation of neural networks based on how real neurons work, where the actual neurons do the symbolic processing on their dendrites. Okay, so there's a kind of subsumation and a consummation of kind of like a whole bunch of kind of research paths into this kind of new way of looking at things. And the problem with symbol grounding, how does kind of symbolic representations become grounded into kind of like sensory data and kind of basic actions? It's because there's a continuum of a kind of symbolic processing from the dendrite, from little patches of dendrite to neurons, the clusters of neurons, right up to the representation of language. Okay, so now point 5. Okay, point 5, he calls a tribe the analogizers, which means he thinks there's a certain tribe that thinks analogy is central to understanding intelligence. We agree, and because this is a theory based on symmetry. Now, analogy implies symmetry. Now, what is deep symmetry? What's deep analogy? It means that what we have is basically representations, and we have this thing called differentiate, select, amplify. But what is it to differentiate? It means to break symmetry. Now, remember the first part of the talk, we talked about invariance, that symmetry means transformation and invariance. Okay, something transforms, something stays the same. But if we differentiate, we are breaking symmetry. What it means, as we recursively differentiate, we basically recursively break symmetry. And what it creates is classification structures. when we have these classification structures, it means we can do deep analogy, because the deep analogy is to go up the tree of classification. And what we described in the first talk of this flexible language. Now, you can't have brittle analogies. So that's where the kind of flexible language, the binary trees, I showed my smartphone that literally flex around. So it's literally a flexible language for doing a kind of like superficial analogy, but also this kind of symmetry classification tree for doing deep analogy. Okay, the last tribe is the Bayesians. Okay, I don't know why he calls it a tribe, because it's like a statistical method that has a kind of cult following. Now, what we propose is that the brain doesn't really do Bayesian analysis. Okay, many people, psychologists and Bayesian statisticians, they think the brain does, but then most people don't really find Bayesian statistics intuitive. So that's one thing against it. But there's something fundamental about the Bayes equation. It's really important. Okay, so this equation is actually really utterly simple. So what's the relevance of this Bayes equation in our scheme of things if we think that what's happening in kind of Bayesian statistics is actually what's happening in the brain, or is actually even necessarily relevant for artificial intelligence? We think it's this. What is this? Okay, this is the only kind of equation in these talks. Okay, so what it is, the Bayes kind of equation is utterly simple. You could derive it as a teenager looking out the window in a maths class. It's utterly simple, but it's utterly profound. Okay, it means this. Okay, so the Bayes equation, that kind of notation means the probability of A given B. So it's about conditional probability. If I've given B, what's the probability of A? Now, the important thing is that it expresses it in terms of B given A. You see, there's an inversion. Now, historically, the Bayesian formula or Bayesian probability theory was called inverse probability. So that's the fundamental inversion. I'm interested in probability of A given B by expressing it in this kind of inverted B given A. What's the significance of that? Okay, it's this. I'm just going to stop the screen share. Okay, the significance is this. Now, okay, I'm back to being a baby again. Okay, I know nothing about the world. Okay, what I'm interested in what predicts reward. Okay, I'm interested in, okay, A is the reward. A is the sensation of reward, pleasure. Okay, I'm interested in the B's that predict the A. So A given B, I want to know the B's that predict A. Basically, that's what I want to know. I want to know that there's a certain sensation that satisfies my hunger. There's a certain thing I need to do to get baby food, and a certain thing I need to do, etc., to get the baby food from the shop. I need to form this chain of association backwards in time in order to learn to predict the world, essentially. Now, the trouble is this: I don't know what predicts A. Okay, there could be. There are in this room, in this simple bare room, there are hundreds of factors which can predict things. And as I go through life, I can't track all these, millions of combinations of factors that might predict what I'm interested in, A. And these are all the kind of swarm of B's, which might be the kind of predictor of A. What's far more tractable to do is to do it in terms of not A given B, but B given A. So back to our equation. Okay, so I'm interested in predicting A given B. Let's just screen share again. Okay, so back to our equation. But it's far more tractable to see the problem in terms of B given A. Well, what it means is that B given A, it means that I have that sensation of hunger satisfied. I feel good. Okay, so basically I'm given A. I feel I've had the reward. Okay, now B given A means I've been given A, then what are the B's that temporarily, spatially are close to my reward factor? Okay, that's a far more tractable problem because there's only a small number of things that happened before my hunger was satisfied, aren't there? So that's a far more tractable problem. So going back to our diffusion limited aggregate, it means that basically when it comes to the stickiness factor of our backward chaining diffusion limited aggregate is not like a DLA, that every particle sticks to every other particle. The particles which are Bayes scored, the B's given A, which score highly, i.e. actually predict A, they're the ones that stick on. Do you see it? So the kind of like a Bayes formula is this kind of inverted way of looking at things. You're given A, then you backward chain to create this kind of backward structure of the things that predict A. And then the B itself becomes sticky. The B becomes the A. Then you want to predict all the other, call them B2s that then predict B1 or the new A. So the fundamental inversion, I mean, to explain in simple terms, if Bayesian analysis is inverse probability, what's the fundamental inversion in our lives? Okay, the fundamental inversion is to do with time, that things happen forwards in time, and that basically there's an inversion is backwards in time, that in order to predict the things that lead to reward, it's far more tractable to work backwards, i.e. backward chain, which is exactly what psychologists call this kind of higher order conditioning process, than it is to track everything in order to discover what predicts the kind of rewards we're interested in. So in a kind of intuitive way, that kind of like explains what the kind of like how we look at Bayesian analysis in our scheme. Okay, so that is a kind of a very quick way of unifying, given what we've already explained, existing AI. As to the next step, I mean, in the diagram we used in the first talk, kind of emphasize the importance of generative predictive AI. We think it's absolutely right that what we've shown so far is basically that everything that happens in your life from a fertilized egg is one great big generative process, you see, and that basically everything that happens in your brain is predictive and it's generative. So it's in neuroscience, it's called, now, it's very fashionable. It's called the predictive coding hypothesis. In America, it's often called analysis by synthesis. There's a guy in London, Carl Friston, calls it active inference. It means, this is very fashionable, and I think it's right, it's absolutely right. Okay, what it means is basically, unlike neural networks, unlike existing AI, when we recognize something, we don't just let the information flow through our kind of synapses and then a symbol pops out, that's a cat, that's a dog. How brains work is basically, okay, back to those top-down pathways again, 80% of all the pathways are top-down. When we interpret something, we always make a prediction. We don't just passively recognize something. We always anticipate what's going to happen. It means that basically, once we see all the brain as one great big generative predictive process, it means basically we solve a major outstanding problem in AI, which is how neural networks learn. There's something very bad about it because it basically takes thousands of iterations. Iterations to learn a concept. Andrew Ng says, you don't train your baby to recognize a cup by showing him 10,000 cups, but that's how neural networks learn, which is ridiculous. Okay, so that's the kind of problem in existing AI, and also this problem of basically transfer learning. The new learning basically doesn't transfer the old concepts. And also another problem is in existing backpropagation nets is what's called catastrophic forgetting. So basically new learning wipes out the previous learning. So what's required is incremental learning. And the other thing is on the fly. So what's wrong with existing AI backpropagation networks? There's two modes. There's offline mode, which does all the learning. And then when you put the neural network into action, there's no learning. And basically then it does all the kind of recognizing inference and there's no learning going on. And then you have to basically put it offline to do all the training that can wipe out the previous learning. You see, that's not how humans work. So what's required is on-the-fly learning. By seeing the brain as one great big generative predictive process, and that all kind of things we recognize, everything we do involves this generative predictive process. Can you see? I'm automatically and necessarily transferring from previous experience. I find the best match to this current situation, and I basically transfer my previous knowledge. And if I'm going to work every day, I have a kind of idea. If I've done the same job for 10 years, the same train, the same road I walk down, then basically I have a perfect prediction of what's happening. Okay, so it means that's one case of zero-shot learning. There's nothing to learn. But everything we do, everything we recognize involves this kind of projecting a prediction on it. Now, in terms of learning, what does it mean? It means that basically we find the best match, and then we incrementally add the deviation from expectation to that best match. And that's a far more compact way of learning. And this is where compositional learning comes in. We basically, okay, look, when you see someone who looks like your relative, oh, that's like my brother, but he's got a hooked nose and he's only got one eye. Okay, a deep learning neural network will basically go through that new face 10,000 times, basically wipe out the old face. It's far better to basically have a projection and say, okay, based on my previous knowledge, that's the best match. that person looks like my brother. And then you basically incrementally add the concept of a hook nose, then incrementally add compositionally an idea of an eye patch and any difference of what you're seeing deviating from that best match of your brother. And that's very compact. That's one-shot learning, few-shot learning. It's very energy efficient. So by using this generative predictive way of looking at things, coupled with everything we talked about, compositional learning in neurons, basically we solve in terms of what's wanting in the current generation of neural networks. Okay, so really, so far we've kind of like kind of explained a kind of like better way of looking at the brain in this kind of symmetry way. But along the road, we basically, some of these biggest issues in artificial intelligence, the solution kind of pops out. Okay. We're gonna, okay, this is a good place in the talk just to field a few questions. So Andre Amorin, you had your hand up. Sorry, I didn't, because we're gonna do the questions in the middle of the talk. You got a question there, Andre? You can unmute yourself. Okay, Andre seems to be not there. Anyone else have any questions? If not, then we'll just roll on.
Oh, this is Matt. I've got a question.
Matt, hi.
Okay, so how do you implement reinforcement learning like in AI or machines? Is there any way you can like summarize that real quick, or is it? Oh, you can go.
Yeah. Essentially, what we do is this. I mean, back to our binary trees and our binary grids. We use the binary grids to model the cerebral cortex. And then going back to our diagram, we basically modeled that circuit we saw earlier. Now there's a horrible mess. Okay, let me go back to that diagram earlier. Let me just stop the screen share and just basically close that window and then go back to that diagram of that reinforcement learning circuit. Okay, and then start the screen share again. Guys, zoom is fiddle it and start. So that circuit we saw earlier, it's horrendously complex, but there's a way of actually simplifying that circuit as just a loop. Now, there's this guy called Henry Markram, and he does this thing called whole brain emulation. And his idea is basically simulate every single neuron, every single ion channel, model every single dendrite, every single axon using masses of computing power. He had €1 billion to do it. Okay, it failed spectacularly. What we suggest is basically we do have the overall brain architecture. What we're doing is we're imposing that binary tree language upon this architecture. So we've abstracted away everything unnecessary. Obviously, blood vessels, we don't have to simulate that. We don't have the, but what I'm saying is, once you're abstracted this binary tree language, neurons as binary trees, we strip away the bare essence of what goes on with information processing in its most distilled form, and that's what we simulate. So yes, we do create these kind of like kind of virtual stratum, and we simulate the dopamine neurons. And then we simulate that backward chain, we simulate the forward chain, and we simulate the layers of the cerebral cortex. And it's literally a reverse engineer of the brain, but it's a reverse engineer of the brain based on a theory that can decompose all these separate components in its most minimal form. So it's very compact, it's very efficient, it's very optimal. And theoretically, it'll run very fast. So when Henry Markram uses banks and banks of supercomputers to simulate a tiny sliver of mouse brain, we propose that the orders of magnitude saving in efficiency is not just, several orders of magnitude. We're talking many, many orders of magnitude. And the trick really is to get something, like intelligence into something very compact, like something IoT, like a basic computer or self-driving car. So that's the aim. Does that make sense? We're not directly simulating like Henry Markram. We're basically capturing the fundamental structure in our binary tree language, and then we're simulating that binary tree language.
All right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Any other questions, or else any other questions, and or else we'll roll on. You can unmute yourself. You can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question. Okay, so 3, 2, 1. Okay, we'll roll on to the next section, which is, okay, beyond the cutting edge. Okay, now we're going to talk about really the hardest problem in AI is recursive self-modification. Okay, so the folks in AI have no idea even how to think about it. Okay, theoreticians don't even know how it can actually possibly begin. They'll say, at least if we have the level of intelligence at a level of a human, then surely that is when recursive self-modification can happen. because then that AI can be a computer scientist and modify, you know, AI programs. We think there's a far more powerful answer to the question of recursive self-modification that is gained from our kind of evolutionary way of looking at things. Now, remember in the last talk, we described how this very old idea that evolution evolves evolvability. It's not a static function. The actual function of evolution itself evolves over, you know, basically the function modifies itself. So in evolution is inherently self-modifying. And it's recursively self-modifying in a very fundamental way, which we'll show in a minute. This diagram here is meant to show the kind of like essence of recursive self-modification. It's the idea of basically processes that, okay, create structure, but then the structure encodes a process, which then goes on to change that structure. But the process and structure are the same thing. Now, it sounds very incongruous, doesn't it? Because it's like the way we normally understand functions. Okay, this is okay, mapping. We'll introduce the idea of mapping in order to explain recursive self-modification. This absolutely simple stuff, absolutely ABC maths, the fundamentals of mathematics. Okay, a basic function is described as a set of mappings. So if I have x, then it maps onto a value of y. So the function y equals fx is a mapping, basically. Now, what you have in a mapping is a domain, a range of a bunch of numbers that maps onto a range. So any function can be defined in terms of a domain and all the mappings into the range. Okay, that's mapping basically. Now, mapping is a very kind of, you know, universal concept. You know, one thing implies another, maps to another. So it's very universal. Now, we just described mathematics and logic, so functions as mappings, but also logical implication is like a mapping. If something implies something, then that maps to the other thing. Conditional probability, transformations, they are mappings. Okay, and in computer science, logic gates, one combinatorial state maps to another. An entire CPU is a combinatorial state, and that will map to another. So in all computer science, finite state automata are all mappings. Now, if you think about the brain and behavior, neurons are also mappings. They map a signal from the dendrites into an output. So it says my internet connection is unstable. Okay, so hopefully, fingers crossed, I can still see you. It doesn't cut out. Okay, so synapses and receptors, they are mapping. They take on a neurotransmitter and it maps onto kind of like ions coming into the neuron. And these recurrent loops are also mappings. They're taking a brain state and a mapping to the next brain state. They're kind of like cerebellar striatal loops. But you see, the entire brain, a perception action cycle, you're perceiving something, then you're acting, and then the action will create another perception, and that will map to another action. So mapping is a very general concept. Now, what's really of interest to us is generative mappings, generative processes like evolution ontogenesis, which we talked about earlier. Now, okay, in the last talk, we talked about how a simple mapping process, a simple recursive function can create our arms and legs, create our limbs and our hands. Okay, so the mapping process is this. From this condensation, from this progenitor field, F, we can map that to B. Okay, so that maps to B. And once we have B, we can break a bit off. That's a mapping. Okay, so once we have that kind of a little bit broken off, that is like diagram 1, isn't it? So basically, then we can branch that again. By recursively applying these mappings of one state to another, we can generate one bone, two bone, many bones, fingers, which is basically the generative procedure which generates human arms, cat limbs, bat wings, whale flippers, etc. So through this process of generative mapping, we have made a kind of biological form. Now, okay, these look like trees, don't they? They're not trees, they don't exist. These are called Lindemeyer systems. Okay, it's exactly the same thing as we had just now with the whale flippers and generating arms and legs. It is basically, it is a mapping process, but now we're not using progenitor fields or condensations. We are mapping symbols. And that same mapping idea creates new strings of symbols. And we can then draw that bunch of symbols as a tree. So the Lindemeyer system can actually kind of create these kind of biological looking forms. And another example is that of a binary tree. So again, mapping to create these kind of like fractal trees. Then you add fancy graphics to make these kind of like biological looking forms. Now, Lindemeyer systems and the mapping process we talked about is a very general thing that extrapolates to what's called lambda calculus It also extrapolates to kind of logic, formal axiomatic system derivation systems. They're all mapping systems. They map one state to another. Okay, so symbol states map to another. And it's a very general thing that we can use to generate language. We can use to generate mathematical propositions. So when we talk about generating Lindemeyer biological forms, that same mapping process can also be used to generate language and also used to generate mathematical propositions. So it's a very general and powerful thing. Now we go from mapping to recursively self-modifying mapping. Okay, so we had domain and range earlier on, but this is something different. Okay, what we do now, okay, basically we change it because it's recursively self-modifying. There is no domain and range anymore. It means that basically the SR stimulus response mappings, okay, become a kind of unified domain and range. There is no one domain and one range because there's only one object that recursively self-modifies itself. So therefore, there's a kind of looping back of the unified domain and range to itself. And what does it mean? It means that basically, when you look at it this way, these generative mappings, it means that the output from the previous cycle becomes the unit by which the next cycle generates new mappings. Okay, so let me explain using a kind of like a kind of biological example. Now, look, if I evolve one finger, okay, then I don't have to re-evolve all the other fingers. I take that same basic program, I basically duplicate that program, don't I? And I can duplicate it, 3 times, 4 times, and have it modified to make a farm. Okay, a centipede evolves one leg. It doesn't have to re-evolve all the, 15 to 177 pairs of other legs. It just duplicates the same program. And once I have a leg or a hand and an arm, I don't have to re-evolve. Once I have a right hand and right arm, I don't have to re-evolve the left hand. I just take a mirror image. It means that basically the unit by which evolution happens, okay, are the past products of that evolutionary process. So the evolutionary process feeds back on itself to create ever more complex forms, but those complex forms becomes the unit by which future steps in evolution happen. Okay, so that's one example of recursively kind of modifying function, because the function has changed. The unit by which future incremental changes happen it basically augments itself. Now, with that one example, which is quite simple, it's quite elementary, we've actually captured what 2 very prominent cognitive scientists and early creators of artificial intelligence, Herbert Simon, Nobel Prize winner, and Alan Newell, they believe that this process of chunking, recursively chunking concepts, is the key to creating artificial intelligence. In a very succinct way, we're basically this idea of chunking biological parts, fingers to make hands, to make arms, and reusing those building blocks, and then duplicating it to make hundreds of, many dozens of centipede legs, and then duplicating entire biological forms. You see, in the biological realm, that is also, when you apply it to the brain, it means that we do the same chunking with ideas. Okay, so that's one example of a recursively kind of like a modifying function. There's a lot more, and to explain the full extent of recursive self-modification now in the last section of the talk, we're going to have to explain what's unique about the human brain to really fully explain recursive self-modification. So I'll give you a very simple introduction to what is recursive self-modification in order to give the basis to understand a far more complex form of recursive self-modification. And we think this is what this unique part of the brain does. It's called the Polar Frontal Cortex. Okay, so we're going to explain the key to human level of artificial intelligence now. We'll skip that. This diagram is to quickly show that basically what we've explained, neuroscience, genomics, and this idea of linguistic structures, and also kind of formal axiomatic system discrete math structures, all in terms of binary trees, and computer science, artificial intelligence. The diagrams just to show that basically in all these areas, okay, computer science, discrete maths, linguistics, neuroscience, and genomics, there's a missing theory of the generative. Okay, we discussed this in the first talk. Evolution lacks a theory of the generative. There's a lacking theory, this predictive coding theory in neuroscience. There's a missing fear of the generative. Chomsky's universal grammar. Chomsky asks, what is that combinatorial generative system that yields an infinite array of structured expressions? Universal grammar, unquote. Okay. And in mathematics, Gregory Chaitin talks about this dynamic formal axiomatic system that can generate all formal axiomatic systems. So all mathematics, basically, because all mathematics can reduce to formal axiomatic systems. Yeah, the simple proposition is this, that basically the missing generative, and also in AI that we talked about just now, the missing generative in all these fields, it's the same missing generative. So explain it for one, we explain it for all these separate 5 fields. Okay, so that's what this diagram is supposed to show. Okay, now we're going to go deeper into this generative process to explain generative mappings in a human brain, and also explain recursive self-modification in the human brain. Okay, there is one part of the human brain which is absolutely unique. Okay, even many neuroscientists will say there's no part of the human brain which is, the great Noam Chomsky believes that there's no part of the human brain which is unique. Okay, there absolutely is, and this has been confirmed, absolutely proven in the past, actually within the past few years, actually past 10 years at least. Okay, this part of the brain is called a polar frontal cortex, and there it is right there. It's like where your third eye is. Okay, so basically at the tip of your prefrontal lobes, that's the polar frontal. Okay, these two represent the monkey brain, and the polar frontal cortex, that's the bottom part of your brain, your orbital frontal lobes, and that's the kind of midsection. So it kind of loops back over here. What's so special about it? Okay, what's so special about it is this. Okay, I'll skip this because we basically want to concentrate time on this really important part. Right, this is just to show other factors that are involved in why human intelligence is so kind of special and unique. So these are factors. What's really critical is this polar frontal cortex. We're going to concentrate on the polar frontal cortex. Okay, so it's unique. Okay, so what's special about it? Okay, now in humans it is larger. Okay, absolutely and relatively. So in this diagram here we have a kind of human polar frontal cortex, the orange bits, and it's drawn to scale. So this is a macaque monkey. Can you see, in absolute terms, obviously, that's far bigger kind of area than this macaque monkey brain. But in terms of relative size, can you see, this kind of occupies a tiny volume compared to what's over here, the human brain. So in terms of absolute size, in terms of, also relative size to the rest of the prefrontal cortex, it is huge. Okay, what's also special about it, it contains neurons, the pyramidal neurons in the polar frontal cortex have the highest synaptic density. What that means is basically the dendrites on these pyramidal neurons in the polar frontal cortex, they have lots and lots of synapses and lots of what's called synaptic boutons. So according to what we talked about earlier, this compositional learning, they're compositing something, they're integrating something in a very dense way. But what are they integrating? What's it integrating? What's it looking at? What's it learning? Now, the third point, unusually, unlike the rest of the prefrontal cortex, this is really unusual. Okay, it is not connected to any sensory area. So the answer to what it's looking at is not looking at the outside world, or it's not looking at parts which process the outside world. It's basically looking at the kind of like the overall hierarchy of those parts which do process the outside world. Okay, there's a kind of grotesque bit of imagery which I thought about earlier today to try and explain this idea. It is like point 4. Okay, what is it looking at? Okay, these neurons with a higher synaptic density, what is it processing? Where the polar frontal cortex is placed, it exists almost like at a hierarchy of all the hierarchies. So you have a speech hierarchy, you have a kind of like spatial processing hierarchy, you have a memory hierarchy, you have these different hierarchies in the brain. It's almost as if the polar frontal cortex sits like an eye looking over all these hierarchies. So all these separate hierarchies are like pyramids with an eye on the top. Okay, and then you have all these separate pyramids with an eye on the top. It's having one great big eye that then looks at all these pyramids below, because it's not connected with the sensory world. So it's basically looking at your internal world. It's actually looking at inside what's going on in your head. Okay, so this is interesting, isn't it? It's almost like a, now, okay, this extra apex over the hierarchical apexes is reflected in the connections of this part of the brain. And the connections are very special. Of course, okay, it's connected with these apexes. So it's connected with the apex of speech, the apex of cognition, the apex of spatial processing, the apex of semantics, and some of these connections are here. Okay, so this diagram is to show a 2014 Oxford study that absolutely categorically showed that this part of the brain, which is a part of the polar frontal cortex, is absolutely unique in terms of connectivity patterns with absolutely unique in the human brain. So this is a 2014 study, which really kind of nailed it, I think. Okay, in terms of connectivity, these are some connection diagrams. Okay, so the connection patterns are really special. Okay, let me go through some of these very special connections of the polar frontal cortex. So the polar frontal cortex is here. So it's not drawn in, but area 10 is right here. This is called a cingulum bundle. Okay, so in a monkey, it's very primitive, isn't it? But in the human brain, it's far more pronounced. You see, the cingulum bundle connects the polar frontal cortex to this massive swathe of the brain called the precuneus and the posterior cingulate cortex. Then it loops around to connect with what's called the retrosplenial cortex, which is to do with memory recall and spatial processing. Then it loops around to the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus, and the kind of perirhinal parahippocampal areas to do with memory formation. Okay, so memory. Okay, this area here is very involved in what's called first-person perspective or egocentric perception. In the first talk, we talked about the guy or patients that lose part of their right parietal lobes. They lose half their world. So lose half the street, they lose half the plate of food, they lose half a letter, half a picture. This kind of binary subdivision of the world is exactly mediated by this part of the brain called the precuneus, and precuneus connects with the parietal cortex, which is lost in these hemi-neglect patients. Okay, another diagram here shows the extent, the thickness of this connection, because that's the polar frontal cortex. And this shows some of the kind of thick, kind of projections into this kind of egocentric spatial processing area to do with navigating first person's perspective. It's like when you play these video games, first person shooters, that's basically what it is. That's first person perspective. And this is the part of the brain that processes it. It's basically spatial mapping, egocentric spatial mapping, it's called. Okay, some other connections that are really important with this polar frontal cortex. Here's a monkey brain. Okay, so that's what we talked about just now. It also has very dense projections in the human brain, especially with the amygdala. So the amygdala to do with emotional processing. What's called pro-isocortex, which is like the kind of like the kind of very tip of the temporal lobes. And this diagram is very important because this section here, okay, this is the superior temporal gyrus, and this okay, it's not drawn in this diagram, but in the human brain, what's called the polar temporal cortex is this bit here. In a human brain, the polar temporal cortex is very heavily connected with the polar frontal cortex. Now, this is really important because the superior temporal gyrus is involved with language processing spoken language, and at the very tip, the polar temporal cortex, this bit here, has been called the semantic hub. So this is where kind of all concepts, language becomes meaningful. Okay, this is where it's all kind of like the real actions going on. In terms of meaning, this is where it's kind of like you know, kind of where all the integration of these different things that you talk about is happening. All the kind of cross-correlating, the kind of connections between things that from which you derive meaning. Okay, so what is it doing? Okay, so what is it doing? Those are the special connections. That's why it's so special. Okay, but what is it actually doing then? I mean, you've described a bit of neuroanatomy, its connection, and some of its special properties. What is it doing? It's doing this. Okay, it's doing a whole bunch of things. It's doing, okay, firstly, it's doing this. Okay, so what is kind of really universally agreed, and what most neuroscientists will say is that it's doing multitasking and recursive subtasking. So this is a study, a meta-study of over 100 MRI studies, and this is a composite study. And what it's showing is basically the functions of this polar frontal cortex. You see here, at the very tip, multiple tasks, multitasking. Mentalizing, we'll talk about in a minute. Here's memory processing. Now, multitasking is really important. I mean, multitasking is something which we do, which is absolutely essential. And also, it's something that computers do, which is absolutely essential as well. And also recursive subtasking, you know, looping into subroutines is really important to how computers work. So the most conventional and most widespread view of the functioning of the polar frontal cortex is exactly this multitasking and recursive subtasking. But how's it doing it? Okay, how it does it is this. It does it in the same way as a computer does it. Okay, so how does a computer do multitasking and recursive subtasking? Okay, we'll talk about single CPU computers. Okay, computers are multi-core now, but we'll talk about one computer, one CPU, and this is how it will do multitasking. So the computer's doing a task, and basically what it does, it takes a snapshot of its system state, and it puts that system state onto what's called a stack. It's a memory stack, basically, and it's a stack because it's first in, first out, like trays in the cafeteria. So it takes a snapshot of what it does, puts it on the stack, and does this other task. When it wants to switch the first task, then basically it pops off the data, the snapshot of system state from the first task, and it loads it back into its CPU again, and then it kind of pushes the other task maybe on the stack as well to come back to it. So multitasking, okay. And recursive subtasking is the same. When a computer does a subroutine, basically it will do the routine. When it has to go into a subroutine, it will basically take a snapshot of that subroutine system state, and they put it on the stack, and they'll basically then go into the subroutine. And then when it pops out the subroutine, it will take off from the stack the system of the enclosing subroutine. Now, in order to make this easy to understand, okay, for instance, okay, a very contrived example. Okay, so I'm watching a DVD, and basically, a very contrived example. Then suddenly I realize I'm thirsty. I'm thirsty. Oh God, I'm thirsty. Then I realize I'm thirsty. Okay, so I'm watching. So I stop the DVD. Okay, so I stop the DVD, and then there's no fizzy drink in the fridge. I can't drink water. I want to drink fizzy drinks. So then I have to go to the shop. Okay, go to the 7-Eleven. Okay, then I realize I've got no money. Okay, so then I have to do a subtask. I pop that, task of watching a DVD, going to the shop to the stack, and then I'll do a subtask. I have to go to the bank. And then I stand in front of the cash machine. I do a subtask. I have to push in the pin. I have to put the pin number each, and then each, kind of like a number is a subtask within that subtask. And once I've done that, I pop out of that task, and I'm basically on my way to the shop again. I got the money, and then I get the drink, okay, and then I have the drink, and then I pop out of that subtask. I'm not thirsty anymore, and then basically I'm back in my house, and I turn back the DVD on, and I'm back to the original task. You see, that's recursive processing. So to do it in kind of very concrete terms, so you fully understand it. We take these abilities for granted. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in my 20s, in the 90s, 94, 95 kind of thing, I had this phase, and I kind of regret it that I was in it for so long, of taking ecstasy. I did it a fair bit in my 20s. Okay, one time, there's one weekend where I had such an amazing time. It was amazing. And then you have the come down, you have the kind of like, hypochondria, lack of motivation. But there's something really quite worrying happened. Okay, I midweek, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday, I was in my flat, and I walked to the kitchen. Okay, and then I forgot what I came into the kitchen for. You see, I made myself prematurely senile. Okay, what ecstasy does, it boosts the serotonin levels, and basically, and then you get this amazing high. So what happened was all my serotonin was depleted, and your frontal lobes need serotonin to work. So I made myself temporarily senile. I walked in the kitchen, it wasn't anything obvious, like make a cup of tea. I had to go back to my room, back to my desk, and yeah, that's what I went to the kitchen for. Okay, so this kind of popping in, popping out is something we take for granted, but it does involve a mechanism. When we lose that mechanism, we notice it. Okay, so the polar frontal cortex, because it is connected to the memory centers, and because it's the eye that looks over all the hierarchies, it has the kind of inner view of your brain. Essentially, it has the overview. What it means, basically, it has an overview of the system state. So what it means that when we subtask, basically, like a computer, we take a snapshot of what we're doing, then we put it into memory in the hippocampus, because the polar frontal cortex can do that because it's connected to the right structures. And then when we come back to that, we do this other task, when we multitask and come back to the other task, we load back the snapshot of the system state of the other task, and we get back to the other task. Okay, and just like a computer, when we do the subtask, watching the DVD, I was watching a DVD, and then I take a snapshot of myself watching a DVD, and I put it on the stack. And then the subtask is I go to the shop to get a drink. Okay, so you see, so basically then I come back from the shop, and I pop off the stack, the task of watching a DVD again. So just like a computer, with the connections to the hippocampus, with this overview of system state, we can do multitasking, we can do recursive subtasking. Now, okay, point 2. What if I think about something, okay, I'm thinking about something basically, and I take a snapshot, a system state snapshot of what I'm thinking about, and I put it into my hippocampus memory stack. Okay. But what if the subtask becomes to think about the contents of what's on the memory stack? Okay, it means basically I can think about something, snapshot, put onto the memory stack, and then now I can think about myself thinking, because I can look at the memory stack and analyze the contents. Okay, then I can take a snapshot again, put it on the memory stack. Now, okay, here I am looking at the memory stack. I can think about myself, thinking about myself, thinking, and so on and so forth. But if I can take a snapshot of myself thinking, I can put it on the memory stack. I can change the way I think. And if I can take a snapshot of that, basically snapshot memory stack, I can analyze what's there. I can change how I think, but I can also change the ways I change how I think. It means basically this facility is like a workshop of the mind. And it involves this kind of overview of your brain and there's connections to the memory centers to take snapshots and then to be able to analyze those snapshots. Now, what's called mentalizing, okay, the social brain, okay, in the diagram, this red section is to do with mentalizing. What is mentalizing? It's basically ourselves, thinking about ourselves and also thinking about others. It's the social brain, and it's really complex because people are really complex and the social world is really complex. If I can think about myself, I can take a snapshot of myself. Okay, then I can reflect on that snapshot. I can change that snapshot. I can basically change myself. Okay, and then think about that change. But if I can take a snapshot of myself, then I can then think about how someone else would think about me. Okay, then I can take a snapshot of that. Then I can think about, but what do I think about that person thinking that about me? And so on and so forth. Loops of kind of, kind of like introspective analysis of the social realm. You see, I can even change myself. I can then do what's called kind of like kind of reflective decision making. I can make a decision to change myself, and then I can basically animate myself through the world and see what happens. Okay, suppose I get a facial tattoo. Okay, it's going to be permanent. I better reflect on the decision in case I regret it. Okay, contrived example. Okay, so basically, I got a horrible tattoo of a spider on my forehead or something. Something something funny. Okay, and then I can reflect on that. Then what would my mother think? Okay, what would my partner think? What would my kids think? Okay, but then take a snapshot. Then what do I think about that? Do you see? And then in terms of like the great social game of love and kind of like having opposition and all these kind of things, you see, it's a very flexible thing to be able to think about other people, get into their minds, take a snapshot of what they're thinking, and then think about what they're thinking, and then take a snapshot of your mind and in relation to what they think, and so on and so forth to X levels of complexity. So really, the social brain and mentalizing is really enabled. You need this kind of recursive jumping out of yourself, jumping out of social situations, reanalyzing from that angle, from that person's angle, from your angle, in order to mentalize. And this is crucial. This snapshot ability to push things on the stack and analyze these things on the stack is exactly what the polar frontal cortex can do. Okay, the thing we talked about earlier, the connections to the precuneus are really important. It's this massive, thick connection to the precuneus. This is really important function of the polar frontal cortex, because it means, as we showed in the first talk, that this idea of losing half your world. Now, there are several papers that came out recently that was arguing for the idea that spatial mapping is really important for cognition. But what they were talking about is actually, one was co-authored by Edvard Moser, the guy who won the Nobel Prize in 2014 for what's called allocentric spatial mapping, the kind of like GPS kind of grids on the floor spatial mapping. Is saying, look, this is how we use the allocentric map to think. He's saying that evolution has basically requisitioned this ability to navigate in floor space, basically along a kind of grid on the floor to aid cognition. I would argue that the real action is going on with first-person subjective, kind of like a first-person, kind of your view of the world, basically the so-called egocentric map. So as you right now, basically looking at the screen, I can see over there, there's a wall, there's a window over there. That's my first-person subjective experience. Okay, in terms of a computer, we don't want to talk about subjective experience. It's just basically your egocentric view of the world. I would say that's where the real cognitive action is going on. But you think about it, I mean, as a child, I found it very easy to think writing on a piece of paper or on a blackboard to visualize what I'm thinking. And I'd say basically most cognition goes on in this kind of spatial realm. Now the parietal cortex, in terms of mapping space, has been implicated in kind of music, but also in numbers and also processing time. What it means, if I can represent things spatially, okay, it means basically I can then use this kind of snapshot ability to represent these binary trees. Do you remember we binary subdivision space in the egocentric space? It kept binary divisioning because of this hemi-neglect condition. So essentially you can represent egocentric space as a binary tree. Now, with the connection to the polar frontal cortex, it means that the polar frontal cortex can then take snapshots of this kind of blackboard in front of me, take a snapshot, but then I can place blackboards within subsections of another blackboard, like a subroutine. It means I can basically represent music, 4/4 time, common time classical music. Basically, I take subsections and expand on those subsections visually, spatially and temporally. What it means basically, this ability to process space egocentrically as binary trees, coupled with this kind of recursive chunking snapshot ability of the polar frontal cortex, it means what it creates is a universal binary tree processor that can represent space and time, that can represent me walking down the street, that can represent language, that can represent music, that can represent language. I can use this universal kind of like cognitive binary tree processor to process anything, language, space, time, in a kind of interconnected way. Now, okay, so another kind of like ability that this universal binary tree processor gives us is what we talked about earlier, chunking. So we talked about the recursive chunking, kind of centipede legs duplicated, left hand becomes right hand mirror image, kind of recursive chunking of body parts. And Alan Newell and Herbert Simon saying that chunking is happening in the human mind, that this is fundamental to human intelligence. Now, once we have this polar frontal cortex ability coupled with this egocentric map of space, then essentially that is a universal chunking mechanism that allows us to create chunks of arbitrary infinite complexity, what Noam Chomsky calls discrete infinity. And so it's a very powerful facility. Now point 5 is the really powerful one. The really powerful point 5 is this. Okay, go back to earlier diagram. These connections of the polar frontal cortex with the language centers, this is where the real action's going on in terms of metacognition, in terms of quantum leap and ability. Okay, it means like that. This superior temporal gyrus is heavily interconnected with the areas here, 44, 45, which is to do with speech production, okay, on your frontal lobes. So there's kind of reciprocal connections between, okay, I'm wiggling my mouse pointer about, there's reciprocal connections between the two. That's where your inner voice happens. So basically what you hear and what you say, this is your inner voice. Now, if this inner voice section is connected with your polar frontal cortex, it means that polar frontal cortex is like an eye inside your mind, but this connection gives you a voice over that mind. So it gives you a connection to that eye over your mind. So you can see things in your mind, and basically that means you can articulate them, you can recognize them in terms of language. Okay, so when we think, often when I'm thinking about things, I'll have a dialogue in my head. So psychologists say we spend most of our lives talking to ourselves. When I think, there's an inner dialogue or little cognitive tags that I reuse again and again. So I'll say, what was I thinking of just now? And then what I was thinking of just now put back in my mind. People have noticed I say the word basically. It's very bad. It's a very bad habit for, public speaking. But in my internal dialogue, it's a cue. It's like a word that triggers thoughts and triggers things in my head. You see, I'm saying everyone has this. And it's the interplay of this kind of language loop, this kind of like a speech loop we have in our superior temporal cortex and our speech production areas. And it's the coupling of this speech loop with this highest of cognitive areas, the polar frontal cortex. It means we can articulate what we're seeing in our inner eye, in this kind of polar frontal cortex eye, but it also means the opposite. We can drive with language, we can drive the operations of that polar frontal cortex. In the same way, when I look at the external world, I can see a cat. Okay, the cat is walking down the fence, okay, but in my mind, I can reconstruct the motion of that cat walking through the fence in my imagination, or I can paint it, or I can draw it, whatever. Now, this other facility with the polar frontal cortex means in language, in this inner dialogue, I can attach labels to this inner motion of this polar frontal cortex. But with those same labels, I can then animate the kind of like dynamic things that this polar frontal cortex can do. You see how powerful this is? It means that through language, I can basically meta control my entire mind. You see, I'm driving, I'm not just recognizing what's going on in my mind, my words, my inner dialogue is driving my mind. But more than that, this inner dialogue, I can say it to people. Yes, I thought about this, and then I thought about that, and then I considered this, and I rejected that. This is inner dialogue in your head. You can say it because it's in language. This is one of the problems with AI. You can't say what it's thinking. But obviously, we can say what we're thinking in our minds. We can communicate how we got to the conclusions we got to. So this ability, this connection with the language centers, with the polar frontal cortex is really, really powerful. Can you see? It's really, absolutely the meta aspect, which really controls the overall kind of workings of your head. What we propose is basically to take all the things we've talked about in the 2 talks, and we're basically to implement all of it to create human level AI, right from the neuronal level, right to these kind of stratal cortical cerebellar loops, in order to create the next generation of AI. Now, I can go on. The polar frontal cortex is really important. This idea of recursive self-modification is really important. I can go on, but time is getting on. I was going to keep it within 2 hours. Okay, so what we have is really not just a unified theory of the brain and intelligence and life and discrete mathematics and kind of language. What we've covered in the past 2 talks is really the kind of answers to many of these questions in artificial intelligence, machine learning. But we've not specifically gone out to answer these questions. What we try to do, really, point 1 is try to understand the brain, to do a new kind of whole brain emulation and to reverse engineer the brain. But what I'm saying is through understanding these kind of neural mechanisms, understanding how neurons actually work, the answers to the biggest questions in AI, they pop out of this new understanding. So we described earlier, point 2, the unification of some of the central ideas of artificial intelligence, machine learning, kind of a master algorithm, plus. That's a bit quite geeky, isn't it? Plus. And a kind of new generation of artificial neural networks based on real neurons. And how real neurons work based on the most recent understanding, it is inherently compositional. This is the latest issue in deep convolutional neural nets, is the lack of compositionality. It is incremental. It learns like a diffusion limited aggregate. There's no catastrophic forgetting, new learning, wiping out old learning. Is inherently incremental. And this idea of neurosymbolic, reconciling the symbolic level with the subsymbolic. Well, the simple answer is that neurons have a mode which is inherently symbolic. So the answer to some of the most relevant and important questions at the cutting edge of deep neural nets is to be found inherently in the functioning of real neurons. And it's inherently generative, creative, predictive AI. We say that basically from a fertilized egg, everything is one great big generative, predictive, creative process, differentiate, select, amplify. Okay, and we described the desired learning aspects, how we have generative predictive processes will lead to on the fly transfer, one shot or few shot incremental learning. We explained it earlier on. And the polar frontal cortex gives us metacognition. It gives us reflective decision making. Okay, back to the tattoo on my forehead kind of thing. And explainable AI. AI that actually explains what's going on in its head. And the last thing, recursive self-modification. So in a nutshell, recursive self-modification is like the Holy Grail. And this finish off the talk, we just describe basically that the technological singularity, apocalypse for nerds, rapture for geeks, something so profound. It's an evolutionary phase shift in the kind of progression of things happening on this planet, the evolutionary progression. It's a complete phase shift. Basically, the technological singularity is one great big recursively self-modifying loop involving the entire planet, involving the entire, political economy, the world society, the entire world industrial, scientific, technological base. That's what it is, technological singularity. And it comes about through recursively self-modifying AI. So we believe that these ideas are the key to creating recursively self-modifying AI. And it would have been created from recursively self-modifying human brains. Therefore, we would have created AI in our image, as you'd expect from biologically inspired AI. So that's about it, folks. So this is an introductory talk, like a skimming stone, non-technical introductory talk to this new way of doing artificial intelligence. So follow me on social media, subscribe to me, Patreon me, PayPal me, and basically, get in touch. I mean, if you want to help, or if you want to learn more, then basically just keep in touch, because there's loads more information coming out. The next obvious progression of these ideas is essentially taking these ideas and turning it into essentially kind of products, and basically something. One of the problems in artificial intelligence is basically most artificial intelligence companies, they don't have a business model. They can't make money. They can't survive in the world. So what's critical for what I'm doing is basically to create AI, then basically AI that goes into the world and actually makes its living. So what we're going to do is create this startup at end of time, which is the topic at the end of both books I've written, Quest and Fractal Brain Theory. And this is the next step. So keep in touch with me, and there's loads more to come. So there's loads more articles, videos, talks about everything. So, connect with me, and then hopefully see you again. Okay, so that is about it. So any questions? I'm going to stop the screen share. Any questions? That's almost exactly 2 hours. Great.
This is Matt. I've got another question. Okay, so this is kind of relating to a question I asked last talk, but is there any way you can quickly summarize how all this information we've talked about the brain and about binary trees, how all this information can be like converted or translated into like computer code?
Oh yeah, Matt. That's what I've been doing for the past kind of 5-6 years, and really, since the first Fractal Brain talks came out 2012. I got attention, but I got loads of flack because it's basically, it wasn't ready. Basically, 2012, I came up with these YouTube videos, and lots of you will know me from these YouTube videos that I made 10 years ago. So in the meantime, basically, it's been the work has been to formalize the theory in this kind of new mathematical language, this discrete mathematical language. And what's happening now is basically on my laptop and on my smartphone, it's becoming this recursive kind of modifying algorithm. It's taking shape on the hardware I have. Basically, I'm looking at very simple applications because I don't have access like Henry Markham to billions of dollars of supercomputers. So where I'm going to concentrate is IoT, basically. So one market niche is basically Intel executive said, Intel Corporation said that the holy grail of IoT is defect detection in industrial processes. So that's one thing I'm aiming for. Just a very simple application with a laptop, with my smartphone, something that's very simple, like even a doorbell recognizing things. So the code is, I can't say I'm creating super intelligence, but what I'm saying is the code is fractal, it's inherently scalable. So the things I'm writing in the microcosm extrapolate to the macrocosm. Because it's a fractal technology, it scales to bigger things. So what I'm doing now is actually quite simple, but I mean, it's basically, it's a proof of concept, and it's basically to find a very simple beginning application to just impress people, really. So nothing is speech recognition, and also simple, visual recognition to just give demos. So featured talks will be much more like, demos of computer code. Does that answer your question, Matt?
Yes. So you're basically just using all this information from basically Fractal Brain Theory to basically guide you in programming, like algorithms and stuff like that.
It's basically, I'm prototyping in Java, and I know it sounds a funny thing to say. People think Java's hard, but C and C++ is hard because it's unforgiving. So Java's easy because you can make mistakes and it still runs you. So I'm actually prototyping in Java, and then the bits that really work nicely, I then convert to C++. So yes, it is that. It is a slow process of basically taking essentially ideas from neuroscience, and then, like I said earlier, interpreting those ideas in terms of this binary tree language to make it in the most minimal kind of description I can possibly get, and then coding that into my laptop and then getting it to work on. What we've actually got is actually a kind of like a parallel computer. I mean, there's 8 cores on my ThinkPad, and there's 8 cores on my mobile phone, but actually connected. So I actually got a parallel computer. Mobile phone is connected with my laptop. It's actually a very fast link, and it's almost like currently it's 20 hertz that they keep updated, but in the future with faster and with 5G it will be 40 hertz. So it is a work in progress, but I think what I just need to do is do demos of the basic proof of concept. That's what's going to happen in the next this year and next year. Okay, so any other questions? Any other question? You can unmute yourselves. You want to ask a question?
Something in the chat.
Oh, something in the chat. Okay. Oh God, I'm new to this. I'm new to. Thank you. So amazing. Have you ever thought about a fractal architecture of a CPU GPU? Well, yeah, actually, but I mean, in the meantime, really, what I'm considering now is just basically implementing the fractal brain architecture in terms of existing processes. So, in terms of fractal architecture, yeah, I mean, in my fractal brain theory book, I talk about one communication network architecture using supercomputers, which is fractal. Effectively, it is self-similar, it is recursive, and that's a binary factory. So actually use that as an example of essentially that is a fractal architecture. That's a scalable kind of a binary tree, a way of basically forming a connection network between supercomputers with tens of thousands, even millions of CPUs. So yeah, that's one example of a fractal architecture. Now, in terms of GPUs, I mean, in the last talk, in the questions and answers, we discussed how one of the problems is not the amount of compute power, but the problem really is in terms of getting the data to the CPU. That's the real problem. So in terms of fractal architecture, I see a fractal hierarchy that kind of disperses itself into the kind of memory, basically. I've been thinking about that. So that not in a binary tree way, but or a binary factory way, but in a kind of, in a fractal way, but basically using more links than just a binary factory. So I've been thinking about it, but right now the main consideration is just getting Java and C++ code to work right now. Okay. Okay, so any other questions?
Just a big thank you. It was very interesting, and the
whole message. Okay, go on.
No, just very interesting, and the whole concept of thinking of evolution as a kind of a learning process is really, to me, which I'm not very educated about this stuff, but it's really revolutionary. It's similar to the thought about the invention of memes as a non-physical process of evolution of ideas instead of evolution of biology. And
yes.
And the fact that the similarity between the process of evolution and the process of learning, it's fascinating. So for me, this is the biggest thing that I got from this talk. So thank you.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's exactly what we covered in the last talk, because we talked about Leslie Valiant, the Harvard computer scientist. This is exactly that. There must be a unified theory between human learning, and evolution. So this idea, this differentiate, select, amplify algorithm, essentially from a fertilized egg to everything, ontogenesis, to the formation of our bodies and brains, to all the behaviors we emanate through our stratums and cerebellum.
So this is whole generative behavior, actually. So it's a generative processes. Yes.
That learning is inherently generative. We're not a blank slate. We're not like a wax, and then someone kind of imprints things on the wax. It is an active generative process inherently. Yeah, totally. And also, unlike backpropagation networks, basically they like offline mode, the training mode, they're dumb. So, tens of thousands of iterations wash over their synapses, and then to learn a new concept, they forget all the other concepts they learned before. So this is a different way of looking at learning. Yeah, definitely. Wow, that's a marathon session. So any other questions? Any other questions? Whilst we just stop record. Oh no, did I stop record by accident? No, it's still recording. Excellent. Also, I'm going to stop recording. We'll just chat. So any other questions before I stop record?
Yeah, I have a question actually. Why?
Okay, so Max.
Yeah.
Oh, Max. Okay, great. Max, go for it.
So what do you think the role of mirror neuron plays as well? And could they potentially be related to collective intelligence? It's like, also, how do you expand your theory upon just one brain into a collection of brains?
Oh, okay. Can you say, Max, can you say the very first sentence again? I didn't quite catch that.
How do the mirror neurons fit in your model?
Oh, mirror neurons. Okay, mirror neurons. Okay, mirror neurons. I guess like mirror neurons, empathy. You know, monkey sees something, another monkey doing something. It can copy that behavior. So yeah, mirror neurons. I mean, basically that's part of the social brain. So basically, we can perceive what other people are doing, and then basically map what that person's doing into our own state. So that's part of mentalizing. So that's really important. So obviously, you know, we have to interpret what other people are thinking, what other people are doing. Then we interpret that in terms of what our own brains. You know, the old New Age truisms that what you hear every New Age speaker say, that what's in your head, you interpret the world in that way. So if you have, you know, negative thoughts and you interpret actions of other people in negative ways, and your mirroring reflects what's actually in your own head. So this is totally part of the mentalizing process of the polar frontal cortex, mirror neurons, very important. Okay, as to how does the theory extrapolate to many brains? Okay, one thing it does, okay, before I explain how it extrapolates to many brains, it explains how one brain can be in many places. It means that basically if I use binary trees to represent different places in space and time, like a city, there's one shop, there's another place, there's my car, I get into that car. These are places, but all represented as a binary tree. It means I can take a snapshot of myself. I can represent myself. Then I can say, here's me in that place doing that task. And then here's me in this other place doing another task. Obviously, I can't be in different places at the same time. So I have to do it in sequence. It means I can extrapolate myself into different places in different times. And then I can plan things, complex behaviors. Do you get it? Now, with respect to, that's one person spread out in different places, but that same idea also extrapolates to the idea of basically making lots of people do some task in a kind of like organized way. So, okay, so on one level, you have hierarchies and you basically have coordination, but on another level, you have networks. So the brain isn't just a hierarchy, there's actually lateral connection. Okay, so basically the theory extrapolates in such a way that there's a way of looking at neurons and parts of the brain as people and organizations. So completely, I mean, the idea that the brain, like we're made of cells and we're made of many cells, we're multicellular animals, but in society, it's like a multi, you know, personal kind of entity. And I think that goes on, but the same principles of, you know, differentiate, select, amplify, and the same concepts which I can use to extrapolate myself to many different places and different times can also be used to represent many people doing things at the same time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, I mean, it's there's a lot more to the theory. So it's not just a theory about the brain; it is a theory about society. I know, obviously, we don't have time to discuss all this other stuff, but it goes. There's a lot more to it. That's what I'm trying to say. So this is really like an introductory, skimming stone, non-technical introduction to the artificial intelligence aspects of the brain theory and how it's progressed. I mean, there's so much more. I mean, earlier, okay, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I just, to close, I'll just basically talk about this even deeper unification. At the very beginning of this talk, and we went over at length in the first talk, you know, the kind of unification of life and intelligence, those two columns, neuron as gene regulatory network, as a neuronal network, evolution as learning, creativity, you know, the first diagram. Now, in the beginning of this talk, I showed how the two diagrams link up into a single structure, because, you know, the genome, fertilized egg, gives rise to a body that then produces intelligence, a brain, but then, you know, the single emanation of differentiate, select, amplify. Now the huge idea is this. It takes some explaining, but I'll say what the idea is, and it's absolutely staggering. Okay, it's not just the symmetry going across the two sides of the diagram and then saying the two sides of the diagram link up. You know, fertilized egg becomes a body, becomes a brain. The brain works like a giant genome. Okay, the real staggering, shocking idea is this. And this has really popped out about 3 years ago, and it's very exciting. Basically, the symmetry is not just across. When I put the things on top of each other, there's a single unifying symmetry going all the way down the table, and it reduces to a single symmetry. I know that's shocking, isn't it? You're saying impossible. How can it be? Okay, down the table are neurons and neuronal networks and brains, and then above the table is evolution and ontogenesis. But that's structure and that's process. Well, no, the two sides of the table reduced to a single symmetry and a single symmetrical object. because of recursive self-modification, because the object has a mode that is a process, but has a mode that is also a structure. So that's the shocking thing I will be explaining in due course, but this is where the brain theory has gone. And look, if what I didn't say in the early part of the talk was basically that unification diagram we discussed earlier that unifies neuroscience, life science, linguistics, formal axiomatic systems, artificial intelligence, computer science. What we didn't talk about earlier was basically the extrapolation of all that to the universe. So it kind of dovetails perfectly with the idea of a fractal universe, with the idea of an informational, computational universe, the idea of the universe as a giant brain, the universe as an organism. So that's where the fractal brain theory goes. But if this kind of single symmetry can reduce the two sides of the diagram and can actually, produce this differentiate, select, amplify process, then in all seriousness, this object I can call monad. And we're talking monad as in Anaximander, as in John Dee, as in Riemann Lull, as in Gottfried Leibniz. And that's a huge claim, I know, but this is a huge topic. So I think we'll end it there. In due course, I will fully explain what I just said in the past few minutes. Okay, so that's a good place to end it, kind of like the next step kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to press stop record now, and thanks for joining, and subscribe, Patreon me, PayPal me, but thanks for watching. Okay, so I'm going to stop records. So I'll stick around for a little bit because I don't have kiddie duties tonight, so I'll stop record. Thank God I didn't press stop record by accident. So stop recording now. Okay, stop record.